Welcome. My name is Joe Gahn, and I'm the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American Program, Cert Anthropology, and of Global Health and Social Medicine here at Harvard. And of course, I'm also a psychologist and president of the Society of Indian Psychologists. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to a panel discussion tonight, which is entitled Indigenous Alumni Accounts of the Origins of HUNAP, Harvard Student Activism in the 1990s and this is in some ways an opportunity to convey my affection and warmth and gratitude to my colleagues who are joining us today, because these are folks I remember from when I was an undergraduate student at Harvard. I arrived here as a junior in 1990 and graduated in 1992. And as an older undergraduate, I had served in the military. I spent some time hanging out with the graduate student group who at that time met under the auspices of the Native American program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which was then in Reed House. And that's how I met these fine, wonderful people who inspired me. And I'm really delighted to have each of you join me. So thank you for coming today to talk with us about these issues. Let me start with a land acknowledgement, which HUNAP worked to develop in collaborative fashion with the Massachusetts tribe of Pod. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. I want to just engage in a very brief recollection, which I think will do some memory work, maybe for some folks on the panel as well, about those years that I was here as an undergraduate. I think some of you might have heard a bit of this information before, but one of the things that was really important when I arrived here and got involved with these, at that time, graduate student Native folks here at Harvard was the effort to be thinking about what to do about the Native American program, which was no longer finding a home at the Ed school at that time. In fact, it was suggested, or the worry and anxiety was that it would just close down entirely. There would be no Native American program at Harvard. And at that time, it existed for 20 years. Soft money, so it was always a concern to figure out how this is going to be funded and who was going to run it, et cetera. And so the graduate students in particular, and me just hooking on and hanging out, decided to organize to try to urge Harvard University to not let that happen, to instead adopt the Native American program outside of the Ed school and to make it a university-wide Native American program. Now, that took years for that to happen, but what did happen even as early as my first year here was that Jim Fenelon here hosted a pipe ceremony for the founding of the Council of Native American Students at Harvard, or CONASH. This council was meant to seat Native students across different schools and colleges who would all come together and meet and discuss and talk about ways to try to get this university to fulfill the Harvard Charter of 1650, which, as you all know, commits this institution to the education of English and Indian youth. And so there was a new president at that time, Derek Rock, retired in 1991, and Neil Rubenstein took over the presidency. And so this group immediately got in touch with Neil Rubenstein's office, said, we want a meeting because we have things to share with you about the importance of upholding this commitment to Native American students. And President Rubenstein's office got back to us and said, I'm sorry, we have no time on the calendar until May. And this was September. So we realized that he held open office hours. And we thought, well, okay, open office hours, anyone can go. I suppose he meets with whoever's there first. So groups of us went to these open office hours. 3 successive times we went to open office hours to tell President Rubenstein about the importance of maintaining commitment to Native students through a Native American program. We actually had 7 demands, requests. One was to establish a university-wide Native American program, which ultimately became HUNAP. The second was to ensure compliance with the Charter of 1650 and to establish a scholarship endowment for Native American students. The third, develop and standardize an admissions policy for Native students. 4, increase Native American faculty. 5, establish Native American faculty endowed care. 6, develop and implement a Native American curriculum. And 7, ensure timely compliance with the NAGPRA Act of 1990, which was new at this time. One thing just to keep in mind, broad background, is that this was the quincentenary of the Columbian arrival happening during these years. And so that cast a whole national societal attention to Native and Indigenous issues in a way that hadn't happened in quite that way for some. So without saying anything more, I want to introduce, we'll do turn by turn and let our speakers have the floor to share with you their experiences for maybe 10 minutes, possibly 12 minutes, but pretty briefly, because we want to get to the point where we can have exchange with you about questions and comments you have in response. And so I want to start with Dr. Manley Begay, who is joining us virtually. Manley, there's no great way in this room for us to see you and you, so I think it's the best that we can arrange, but we can see and hear you, so be assured of that. Manley Begay Jr. is a tenured professor in the Department of Applied Indigenous Studies and Department of Politics and International Affairs at the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Northern Arizona University, Flagstaff. Professor Begay is also an affiliated member of the W.A. Franke College of Business at NAU. He is also director of the Tribal Leadership Initiative in the Office of Native American Initiatives at NAU, where he was also has primary responsibility for teaching about Indigenous nation building, Navajo history and philosophy, and directing the Tribal Leadership Initiative. He's a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Education with his doctorate in education in 1997. So, Professor Begay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Gane, and it's good to see Mike Kola, Jim Fenelon, and also Gabby as well, and Angela. It's good to see all of you. I'm actually zooming in from Flagstaff, Arizona. It's been snowing here the past 2 or 3 days. And so we've had up to about 2 feet of snow. So you could just imagine what it looks like outside. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and we need the moisture. But boy, I sure thought I quit shoveling snow when I left Cambridge, you know. Here I am shoveling snow again. But, by way of introduction, for those of you that are Navajo and others, let me just say my clans in Navajo. My so those are my clans. We're a matriarchal society, and I'm originally from Wheatfields, Arizona, by way of Tuba City, and as Dr. Ganes mentioned, I'm actually in Flagstaff. Before I moved here in 2014, I was at the University of Arizona for 14 years, from 2000 to 2014, and before that I was at Harvard. First as a graduate student, and then later on as a member of the faculty, and then an administrator. I was one of the co-directors of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development out of the Kennedy School of Government. And I arrived actually at Harvard in 1988 with all the intentions of studying hard and getting my doctorate as quickly as possible. And I actually moved with my family from the res, where I was a middle school principal at Tuba City at the Eagles Nest Middle School. And during my time at Harvard, I lived in Medford, Cambridge, and also Belmont. At that time, my kids were very young. I had a son that was in grade school. I had a daughter that was at junior high. So you can just imagine just coming right off of the res and then moving to a big city back east, and it was hard, especially for the children, and I worked hard, very hard in my studies. Did very well at Harvard, but then as Dr. Gane mentioned, we ran into a challenge, an issue. Because I came to Harvard with the express purpose of being a part of the American Indian program, which was at that time housed in the Ed school. And the central place for the American Indian program was at the Reed House. So the Reed House is where we lived. We slept there, we ate there, we cooked there, we studied there, we wrote our papers there. And the Reed House was sort of the center of the American Indian program since the 1970s. And then all of a sudden, we were told that we were going to move out, and there was really not very good communication going on from the administration about what was happening, and so we as students became really concerned. There were only 4 of us at that time. There was Irma Visner, who came from Minnesota, Anishinaabe woman, Dolores Dunning, Martha Dimitrov, and Elsie Itta. Dolores, Martha, and Elsie were all Alaska natives. And then later on, Taylor Keene came, Jim Fenelon came, Angela Gabby, and many others came as well. But really, what really changed us as graduate students was this need to save the Reed House and also to save the American Indian program. We were being removed, just out of the blue. And so we really mobilized, we organized, and then we took action. One of the things that we really wanted to do was to understand the context within which all of this was happening, because at Harvard, there's a saying, Harvard operates under an ETOB, every tub on its own bottom. So each of the colleges essentially operate as independent entities. And so there is a sort of one administration that handles all of Harvard. And so in order to really figure out how do we change this? How do we change what's happening to us? And we were really quite fortunate. We had a faculty member by the name of Charles Lilly, who's a prominent American sociologist. And we just all happened to take his class. And one of the students whom came later on was Colleen Larimore, a Comanche woman, actually worked at Harvard, or excuse me, worked at Dartmouth for quite some time. And so Colleen, Irma, and Dolores and myself basically took the helm of organizing, mobilizing, and protesting what was happening to us. And then we used Dr. Willie's theory of change. And it just really fit perfectly with what we were doing. Dr. Willie, had tremendous amount of experience in race relations, community problems, desegregation, and so forth. But his work really set the stage for how we would react and how we would mobilize and take action. And we did a lot of research, as Dr. Gania was mentioning. The research led us to the charter of Harvard University, which, as he just mentioned, specifically states that Harvard was established in 1650 for the education of Indian youths and English youths. Before that time, we felt as though we were sort of guests here, And after the research that we conducted, we realized we're not really guests, This is our university. Harvard belongs to us first and foremost before anybody else. And in the research that we did, we found out that in Harvard Yard, there was actually an Indian college. So years ago, back in the 1600s, after Harvard began to run out of money, they basically used us as Indian people to raise money. And they built this Indian college. So after many years, the Indian college kind of fell apart. They took the bricks from the Indian college and used it to build other buildings in the yard. So if you're walking around in the yard, you see a huge plaque there. That's the building that has the most number of bricks that came from the Indian college. So we no longer felt as though we don't fit here. We no longer felt as though that we were guests. We realized that this is our university. This is our college. It's on native land. And so with that knowledge and understanding, we pushed the envelope of the administration. And we gathered with the Black Student Union, with MECHA, with Asian American Association, and many other groups that just sort of took this action that we're going to change this. We're going to make a statement here, and we're not going to lose the Reed House. In fact, we're going to get stronger. We notified the media and garnered a lot of support from the outside of Harvard. Dr. Gagne mentioned that there was this open office hours where we could meet with Bill Rudenstein, and the administration really was very stubborn in wanting to change, and they wouldn't listen to us. So I made a personal appointment with Dr. Rudenstein, President Rudenstein, and I sat down with him and said to him that if this doesn't change, a lot of stuff is going to happen here that you're not going to like. See, Harvard does not like bad press. The last thing they want is bad media that reflects on their donors and reflects on the university at large. So to avoid the embarrassment of what was most likely coming down the pipeline, he relinquished. And what happened after that was really interesting. We actually had protests. There were sit-ins that occurred in the administration building. Taylor Keene, who's not here, actually talked to me about the sit-ins that occurred there in the president's office. And then in Appian Way at the Ed School, we closed down Appian Way with protests. There were, hundreds of us gathered there protesting to save the American Indian program, to save the Reed House. So I brought an old part of our mobilization and organizing actually dealt with this. I still have the hat from back in the 1980s. So you can see here, it says this Council of Native American Students. And so this was our emblem that we created at that time. But remember, we're older students, we're not undergrads. We were older students that really were doing this. We had families, we had jobs that we came from, and had careers that we had started. And so instead of paying attention to our studies, we were so busy protesting, trying to save the American Indian program. And it took a lot of our time, a lot of our effort, but it was all well worth it, because in the end, the Harvard University Native American program was born. And with that, we had new directors that came on, like Jeff Hamley, Laurie Graham. Laurie Graham and Peter Golia were the ones that raised money with the Oneida tribe to put that plaque on the wall at Harvard Yard. And Leroy Littlebear came later on as a director. And we had a champion as part of the faculty, and that was Joe Colt. And we established a faculty advisory board, which had, obviously Joe Colt on there, Alan Cowder, Jim Austin, Bill Fash, James Hoyt, David Mayberry Lewis, David Potter, Joe Singer, Cornell West, Henry Louis Gates, and others as well. So that's how we organized to be able to secure some leverage with the administration to keep the American Indian program alive. So as Dr. Gagne was mentioned, we began to set up courses. And by that time, I had sort of stepped away from some of the protests that occurred and became part of the faculty advisory board. And we fundraise, and we focus on student recruitment. We established a university-wide program of HUNAP, and we focus on NAGPRA, also the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, because Harvard University has a huge collection of items that came from Native people, including human remains. And so early on, I sat on as a part of the repatriation committee there. And we also began to focus on Native faculty recruitment, just as a way to strengthen the new Harvard University Native American program. So those are things that I remember back then. And with that, I'll stop, Dr. Gagne.
Thank you, Professor Begay. I appreciate that. And we'll, of course, be looking to hear more from you when we open it up for exchange shortly. But before then, let me now introduce Professor Gabriel Kayak, PhD Piscataway, who is a public historian and community engaged curator who centers Indigenous knowledge sovereignties. She was an inaugural curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian for nearly 2 decades, focusing exhibitions on complex identities, social movements, justice, and belonging across the hemisphere. Dobby maintains a specialization in the Chesapeake Bay that is intergenerationally anchored and globally connected. She speaks and consults widely across academic, tribal, and civic sectors. She's also a lifelong Indigenous rights advocate, working with NGOs, grassroots movements, and foundations. Dobby is an associate professor of public history at George Mason University and guest curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She holds a BS in social work from Cornell, an AM 93, and a PhD 99 in sociology from Harvard University. Please, Dr. Ty.
Well, thank you. It's so good to be in community with all of you. Ma'am, it's so good to see you and to listen to what was put into motion over so much time for us to be sitting in this room together. You know, this is really, we're talking about more than a turn of a generational cycle from 1990 when I arrived on campus to where we are now. And just to set, like so many of us, we brought our own conditions, our backgrounds with us. I was pretty young. I was 22 when I arrived on campus and had come from originally from I'd gone through a program at Cornell, which was very focused on Haudenosaunee concepts and unities, with this idea about bringing us full circle, having us go back home. We didn't use the terms at the time of indigenization, but looking at native paradigm shifts. And so it was coming through that. And then from there, I actually ended up spending a year as a human rights fellow at Amnesty International, working on Indigenous rights mechanisms, and had also come from a background from a family very deeply engaged in the American Indian movement in the DC area, and then also through the late 80s was involved with a lot of this search towards 1992, both in Central America, working with people that had been mobilizing mass Native confederations in those areas, confronting genocide, speaking to their rights through the Andes and Amazonia. And so I was I came into Harvard bringing that in and wanting to understand the structures of what had happened to us, right? Like, so it was coming from this background initially from social work and then human rights advocacy, and then thinking, how do I understand the structure, and can we also then create spaces for Indigenous knowledge, Native oral history carriers, the people that had been working on sovereignties, can we bring them into the academy as a channel through us? Like that was my view at the time, and it was really landing here. And at the time, I don't know, I think it's probably from a lot of what Professor Begay had started to cast into motion. I don't know what the administration was thinking, but they brought 9 of us at least into the arts and sciences, 4 PhD programs in arts and science, 3 of us into sociology, and my longtime sister colleague Angela, who I met right away. And it was a critical mass in a moment where we came together. So there was pieces happening here on campus, 1990, the year that NAGPRA passed, the year of the Oka uprising in Canada, what we saw with mass mobilizations throughout the hemisphere, right? And then at the same time, there were many of us, I think, in this generation where we were, I know for me, it was like kind of the youngest end of that red power movement. I was always like the kid, like the little, the little one, bouncing along. And then trying to see about, how are we going to come into the institutional areas to really like inculcate and also transform ourselves and the discipline, and where we can go in to bring all of, that was my view. It's like how do we bring all this energy with us into this place? So it was really, sometimes there's like a moment, it's like a galvanizing moment where the larger world is working in a certain way, and then you have a certain set of people who come together. And it wasn't really planned this way, but that's what happened. And so it's really fascinating, I think, for this evening, I was asking, what is it about bringing us together right now? And looking back and not realizing, so just to say to those of you who are, struggling along, being like, where is this going? Sometimes it just takes that turn to look back and to see, what happens on the longer haul of where we are, and looking into those visions. So while I was here on campus, we all found each other pretty quickly, going over to Reed House, certainly seeing Manley and Irma. And then there was also a lot of interaction. And so I'm so glad you have this land acknowledgement, because it is within the protocol. And I think the way that, how is it we reach out to who are the people where we are. So making those connections into Mashpee, especially spending weekends at Mashpee. And they were experiencing police brutality, and also raising awareness about who they were in those processes. So that's what was happening here, right? Which of course, right, we have to carry these issues of how is it that we also are studying and then also being in places where there were no Native faculty at the time, and even in sociology, there wasn't even anyone who focused on Native people or history or processes. So we had to create this, and it took a lot of, I think a number of us encountered where to push through bringing in knowledge carriers into the literature when it wasn't literature. It took it took a heavy lift, and so it took me a while to get out of here. It was I was here for 3 years in residence, and then it took me 9 years to completely finish with multiple submissions, mostly having to do with not a committee. They didn't want to. They had a hard time accepting orality in sociology at that time. And so how did we bring that forward? I do want to bring in the room, and I'm so glad that there's mentions of names and mentors, but a really essential person was Inez Talamantes. Inez Talamantes was a Chicana and Mescalero Apache religion scholar who was here as a visiting faculty in religion, actually in the divinity school, hired almost all of us to be her TAs, and created this environment, for us to come together, and was only here for several years. And I think many of us, as we, in these academic environments, right, we come in, we come out. There's some levels of turnover, but there's also people who stay in our lives and shape us. So from the time of going, spending the time with her, with people in the Wampanoag communities, with the actions on campus, with those of us who really supported each other. There was the institutional pieces, but something that we created, I think, among us. And when we were talking about creating CONASH, right, this Council of Native American Students at Harvard, at the time, it was the notion of council. The use of the word Native American at that time is probably the way that we would think about Indigenous now, in order to be as inclusive as possible, being able to bring all of us together, you know, at Harvard versus being within specific sites and places. And so that's something that really, I think, you know, carried, you know, I've carried with me through my life, but this was a portal. And it was really, I think what we can see now, a much more impactful one, like than when you're in the middle of everything and you don't really know where anything's going. I mean, you're all like, we're all living history, you're all living history. And there's a time when, you know, we time travel, you know, I was like, oh, we all came back together and we're like, how did this happen? It's like, I'm 55. I mean, it's like the end of the movie where they show like everybody looking like kind of different than they were at the time. But also being able to see that the room and just looking at the circle of all of you in this room is so uplifting. And I'm so thankful for you and for your leadership, Joe, you know, and Scott. It's not an easy one that we've been into. Yeah, I was like, I'm not gonna be able to talk for 10 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Professor Tyek. And now we'll hear from Professor Gonzalez. Angela Gonzalez is an Associate Professor of Justice Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. She holds an AM 97 and PhD 02 in sociology from Harvard University and an Ed.M. 94 from the Harvard Grad School of Education. As a community engaged scholar, her research cuts across and integrates the fields of sociology, Indigenous studies, and public health, with a focus on the complex interplay of social, economic, and environmental factors that cumulatively influence both individual and community health. The research was supported by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Board and Russell Sage Foundations. As an enrolled member of the Hopi tribe from the village of HUNAP Bay, Angela strives to embody the Hopi values of respect and reciprocity in teaching, research, and service. She's a founding member and past president of the Society of Senior Ford Fellows and the inaugural chair of the American Sociology section on Indigenous peoples and Native nations. Please, Professor Gonzalez.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I mean, I know that, you know, you all are getting ready for spring break or something and a very busy time of year. So really appreciate you being here. I think also appreciate the fact that, you know, when, you know, listening to Manley and listening to Gabby, I don't know if I ever imagined this as kind of part of the legacy of the work that we were doing. So it's really very, very gratifying to see so many of you. I don't know if we had many meetings that we had quite as many people. So I feel like hopefully we laid the foundation to make it possible. I also want to kind of acknowledge and really express appreciation to the continued legacy that Joe has done here and to others. This has been a really interesting couple of days. You know, I don't think a lot about, you know, my time at Harvard. I never really kind of thought about it in terms of the work that we were doing then and what the implications would be now. And so it's been an interesting trip down memory lane. As Gabby was saying, when we came to Harvard, it was kind of a little bit of a phenomenal experience in the sense that for those of us in the PhD program, they admitted, was there 9 of us? I think 9 or 10 of us. Some of us had actually met as we were making rounds of different universities for visitation. And I do remember meeting Phyllis Fast, a colleague of ours from anthropology who is now passed. I remember meeting her, I think it was at Yale, I can't remember now which place it was. but having a conversation around, you know, if you'll go, I'll go. Because this sense of community was, I think, when I look back on those years in terms of what we were able to accomplish, we did it as community, not necessarily as individuals. We were all individuals in community, but yeah, it's pretty remarkable thinking about that time now. I know that when I came to Harvard, my path here was very circuitous. I was sharing this with at lunch this afternoon. I think I had stopped out at a couple of different times along the undergraduate path, but kind of found myself here through a variety of circumstances. Some of it, I think, was just being in the right place at the right time, having opportunities that I hadn't necessarily imagined, but eventually, you know, kind of finding myself here, but not really sure that I was going to find a place as a Native person, but also, to be perfectly honest, not really expecting it. The little bit that I knew about Harvard was that this was not going to be a Native-friendly space, and so it was really pretty remarkable to arrive and find that you have these colleagues that, you know, in many ways have become kind of lifelong colleagues, because it was not at all anticipated. I know that when I think back on the time here, and again, you know, this is a very interesting kind of moment to think about it. I was trying to kind of contextualize this in terms of kind of the generational shifts. So there were certainly, you know, many of our colleagues, and Ed.D. certainly being one of them, kind of this first wave of Native or Indigenous scholars that went through higher ed, you know, in some ways after programs like affirmative action created opportunities for them. And I think in some ways, I think of us as kind of that second wave. I think that there was definitely kind of a generational change, not just in our age, but in terms of what was happening in the country. So if you think back, and I know I learned this at lunch today, when I think about coming back here in 1990 and even getting my degree in 2002, I think that was before some of you were even born, which is a really, you know, that'll really kind of mess with your mind. But you know, the late 1980s and the early 1990s was really a phenomenal time in terms of what was happening on the national level. We see the Native American Language Act passed in 1990. We see NAGRA passed also in 1990. Interesting pieces of legislation, the Native American, Native American Indian Arts and Crafts Act, yeah, also in 1990. 1988 was the Indian Gaming Act was passed. So there was a lot that was really happening, and it's kind of in hindsight that I wonder if the intention wasn't necessarily to take advantage of that opportunity. I think it kind of presented a unique opportunity for all of us that were here at that particular moment. And certainly, you know, the role that folks like Jeff Hamley, who was mentioned, and I'm thinking Eileen Egan, who is a staff person in the program, really kind of makes me also, especially being on a faculty end now, think about the importance of kind of like those key people. The fact is, students that we were carrying the water, you know, for so many people is really kind of remarkable. As Manley had kind of suggested, you know, so Gabby, you were on the 9-year program. I think, you know, I was on the 12-year program. You know, there's in some ways when I say there's consequences to the action, there's good consequences, but there are implications, you know, for this type of activism. So I actually didn't finish until 2002, so I was a little bit protracted. But you know, it was a remarkable time. It's so interesting being here now. It's been, I think, at least a decade since I was here. So much has changed, and yet so much has really kind of remained the same. You walk around the square, you know, the stores are totally different, but you know, kind of that sense of energy and impulse from among students and kind of the social activism that you see just looking at kind of the postering and things makes me really gratified in terms of, you know, that there's still a lot of work being done. There's certainly a lot of work that still needs to be done. spending time with the HUNAP staff this afternoon and kind of hearing a little bit about some of the efforts that they're making also makes me feel very gratified. This sense that, you know, in some ways, I don't know if we really recognized at the time that we were building a legacy and kind of like, you know, kind of step laddering it up. But I'm really excited about the fact that you have Native faculty, you have senior Native faculty. Once you get on the faculty and you really realize the importance of having senior people within the institution who have the protection of tenure to be able to do the advocacy work, not for you, but alongside you. I think in some ways we did have many of those supporters at the time, but you know, it still felt very much like almost like we were having to create it for ourselves. So it's really, like I said, really gratifying to see how much the program has changed. The other thing that I was sharing with a couple of folks at lunch that I didn't really appreciate from this experience here is how it kind of created an opportunity, at least for me, and I think perhaps for others, you know, to kind of create and extend a sense of community and connection. The social networks that were really developed here, and the fact that, you know, these lifelong, you know, friendships that had evolved out of this, and to see the work that people have continued to do, it's pretty amazing. It makes me very, I don't want to use the word hopeful because I don't think that that's necessarily it, but it feels a bit like that, you know, you all, whether you intend to or are consciously aware of the fact that, you know, you are really kind of pushing the envelope. You know, it's like Sisyphus kind of pushing that ball or the rock up the hill. It's very much like that. And I hope that for all of you, that whether you're undergrads or graduate students, you know, kind of see yourself as really not beginning, but continuing kind of this longer legacy of really pushing the envelope, creating opportunities, but also, you know, creating a space and making sure that there's space around the table, you know, for future generations of Harvard students, future generations of Native students from your own community, and helping to kind of convey the message that while Harvard can be a very challenging place, it can also be, I think, a welcoming place, if not because necessarily the administration has made it welcoming, but because you have people in faculty and administrative spaces that make it a welcoming space. This, I don't think, is something that necessarily exists in all institutions. And so I hope you see yourself as a part of that collective and really see yourself as a part of, you know, this legacy that, oh, I don't know, it sounds so nostalgic to say that we helped to create. But, you know, I think we have, you know, you too are part of that story, that legacy, and so anxious and interested to hear what you all are seeing, what you see as the current challenges, the next challenges, and how do we continue to kind of push the envelope forward, because we've accomplished a lot, but there's so much more, you know, yet to be accomplished. So, Joe, thank you for having me here. This has really been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Professor Gonzalez. It's great to hear your contribution. Before I introduce Professor Fenelon and Brandon, I know we've got slides, so if we can get those called up. Next, I'm pleased to introduce James Fenelon, who is Professor and Director of the Center for Indigenous People Studies at California State University, San Bernardino. He has published 3 books: Culturicide, Resistance, and Survival of the Lakota Sioux Nation, Indigenous Peoples and Globalization, and Redskins, Sports Mascots, Indian Nations, and White Racism. His latest book, Black and Irish, Indigenous Nations, African People, Indian, Black and Irish, Indigenous Nations, African People, and European Invasions, 1492 to 1790, is appearing soon. Professor Fenelon published numerous articles and chapters, and is Dakota, Lakota, Standing Rock, Gaelic, Gaelish Irish, French, Scandinavian, and advocate for social justice. So please, Professor Fenelon, the floor is yours.
Oh, hana. So first, I would like to give thanks to Professor Bernier, Joe, for making this invitation. We would also often acknowledge the peoples and the lands and the histories that's really been done. Acknowledge our great colleagues in this history, this remembering, especially a person that became Manley Begay, Thank you for recognizing that, Manley. And in thinking of that and what has already been presented, I was thinking this was 32 years ago, this was 30 years ago. And the way that people, both with Indigenous faculty and different programs, the way that that has changed. So only primarily traditional people would introduce themselves in a lot of ways. I think the way, I was trying to remember the way people would often introduce themselves. It is just it's a sea change in knowing yourself, your identity, and who you are. So in the Northern Plains tradition, you would usually greet your relatives. That would be how and then you might talk about who your relatives are in terms of tribal nations, Dakota. And my Lakota is kind of complicated, so I recognize my great-great-grandmother, Huapiluta, and respect the law of that woman. And then we now, often, introduce ourselves in our names. It was great to hear Manley do that way. Dakota Shaje Mitawakim Shukakan Sapagiveshka Imachiape. And then I've been told to recognize all my different heritages, which we've done here, and then thank you for that. And then I asked somebody, it was just a few years ago, because we would introduce them, I'd say, oh, I'm from Standing Rock. Am I really from Standing Rock? What does that mean if I'm not living there for long periods of time? And so I was told to say it this way, Adewa Yakin, Ian Poshtata Okashpe, and then some more after that. And it really means my father is from, and that means from, grew up, knows the place. From this place where the rock or the stone stands upright, which is where the name comes from. And so therefore I have the right to say I'm from there. I was in Fargo because he was back from the war, then going to school. And then to recognize that I'm therefore a member of a native nation, but that'd probably be better, Dakota or Lakota Oyate, associated with a reservation. And also that I am a citizen, so we will often say we're citizens now, of course, responsibilities of the United States. And then I'm a veteran. I like to say it doubled up. I served in the United States military. Thank you, Joe. But I also served with movements. So we like to think of them as being veterans too. And that happened, a lot of that recognition later on. So I'm all doubled up on that. And I like to think of myself as being a citoyen du monde, a global commitment, a citizen of the world. So it's already been brought on up. We've had a land acknowledgement. I bring this one on up because when we developed this with the state water agencies, a lot of people get worried that they're too performative or just symbolic. But when we did this, my co-authors, another Kola, Luke Madrigal, and Julia Bogny, and both of them have passed to the spirit world, were Tongva and Kauai. So they were of the people. So even this one was so strong that the water agency, SAPA, said, we had legal department look at it, and we'll only say you wrote that land acknowledgement, because they didn't want to accept a commitment to change. And that's very important. Some of the things that I managed to bring here, but learned a lot from so many people. And that is arriving here, there were so few natives, and there were new natives, and this descent that Manley and others have talked about. So we looked around and we realized that the only way for us to move forward in movement analysis was to come together. And so we named ourselves in a process. We're a council of Native American students. In my opinion, Harvard did not want us to meet and did not want us to unify as a people. So we did classic movement analysis. We didn't ask for permission. We met in the Kennedy School, the School of Education, Arts and Sciences, the School of Design. We were a moving target and they couldn't get at it. And that was a big part of what happened. And then many great things have been said about the great Charles Lilly. He was really a guiding force in that early time. And he was especially because of his rights with the civil rights movement and so on. And this is one of the things that we would write in the reports. It's really been stated. They cannot be underscored enough. In fact, I believe that they even were trying to hide the charter from us, right? That the very charter of Harvard College itself, And the reason why it happens in 1650 and not 1636 or 37 is because the powers that be in England refused to fund and to charter the college because they wanted to send their sons back to England so they could control them in terms of empire. And so Native Americans are just absolutely important to report all of that, as was well said by people here. I was asked to give a presentation because this was 1990. This was also the 100th observation of Wounded Knee, which some of us feel was a fulcrum point in all of American history. And the attempted suppression, they used to say, this is a disappearing race of American Indians. And so I've been asked to give a presentation, the centennial year up in the Dakotas, and this one was called The Ghost Dance, Sitting Bull's Death and Wounded Knee on Standing Rock. And in the process, we identified that the Sundance and other important, so I guess we go to the next one then, known as the Wiwayan had been actually outlawed by the United States government. This was not known now. Now I know that you're running into this a lot, right? Especially 81, they started to suppress it on the reservations. 82, you have a letter from Teller. But in 83, they produced the Indian Offenses Act. So apparently the greatest offense in the world of the Indian Offenses Act was a Sundance. It's listed even before the made up things, the scalp pins. What is it they hated about that so much? We also found work so there is what I say, and you can really check out Albert Whitehead's book, which is, he's passed to the spirit world now too, Zulia, and A Life of Meaning. And it's really powerful because he talks about this too. We must remember that many people were arrested, many people were imprisoned, people were tortured, people were killed because of their spiritual beliefs and practices at this time. So then we linked it to the Ghost Dance, which was quasi-Christian movement that came into the Northern Plains. That's very important because, and again, the world has come full circle, especially because of the things that Joe has done here. Because we showed that the incorporation, which only the Lakota did, of the ghost shirt was actually a way of recognizing the spiritual relationships without some of the other practices which were made illegal. And yet it was also done with Vecchia, the Messiah will come back, the second coming is occurring, but this time he's Indian, okay? And we're gonna treat him a little better than you folks do, right? And so it was really powerful. So what led to then this death and the great killings, I call it the kill site at Wounded Knee. And this led to an invitation because this actually directly challenged, I've really been reliving this, especially today, but since Joe has instructed us to revisit it, we found these ghost shirts in the Peabody Museum. It led an invitation to give the lecture called From Peaceful Revelation to Death on the Plains at the Peabody Museum, of which they gave me no formal documentation. It's like they didn't want to even have this discussion, even though I did give that lecture. And so then I think they felt so guilty or constrained or constricted or whatever was going on with them. They wanted to show that they really did know. So they took us down into the bowels of the Peabody and they showed us 4 ghost dance shirts. And I knew that they were really powerful. I could feel it. I was involved in ceremony at the time, not so much now. So we came back and I talked about it with a couple of people, especially Manley, and we said, so we happened to know the Intercessor at Greengrass, which was the place where it had been kept the longest in North America, and where the sacred pipeline, they sent army units out to get that, never got it, right? So we asked the Intercessor to come here, and Manley had programs, and he came, and then after looking at all these buffalo robes and all that, to earn his keep or whatever, he goes down there and he looks at all 4. We relived that a little bit today. In the first one, he says, well, this is not good. That was a medicine bundle that was on that shirt. And he looks at the next one, look at that discoloring. And so that's blood. And then look at this other one. And I didn't know until we actually viewed them here today, because they flipped it around. And there was what is known, I'll use the English word, it's kind of the same, as a thunderbird being on the back of it. And I had only seen the front of it when he pointed it on out. And he said something about that. I go, what did he say? Why was it so powerful? I couldn't remember. Well, we just learned today, they said they had the Thunderbird up front because that was the powerful one. They turned it back around. Now I remember, right? And so he looked at it and he said something powerful about that, but he'd only speak in Lakota. And then we get to the fourth one and he looks at them and he goes, this is the most shameful of all. He goes, this is a girl's dress. And they said all four were collected on the battlefield. And that's powerful. So that I will take those extra seconds to say that then we came on up and, you know, it was kind of heavy and revelatory and a powerful experience. And so the then, which I can say now because your people are so good, we have come so far, both because of the programs and the people at the Peabody and so on, that I can say that now. They kept talking with him and he was a big, tall Lakota man, Intercessor and all that. And so finally they said, you know, we're not going to have our university lawyers, you know, defend this. We're going to have our special law firms defend this, which is a threat. They were threatening it. And so then I'll share with you what he said. It was so beautiful. He goes, we have had some experience fighting you people before. Oh, the knees were shaking and getting nervous and all that. So on to the next one there. And so we told that story many times, and I always thought something had been done. I didn't report it. Of course, he was the intercessor. So he didn't, and other people didn't. But I was then told by the great Charles Lilly, and I can't remember the exact words for it, but he said, you know, there's some people pretty unhappy with what you have done here. You know, I told the truth about Wounded Knee and the Sundance and what was happening with the program. I think that probably added a few years onto your program. He told me about something called the Gatekeeper function. And that is that, especially in the higher education, especially PhDs from Harvard, people that might affect the discipline and knowledge itself, right? He says that they will either slow it down, they'll try and get you to be subordinated, because I can tell from talking to you, Jim, that that's not going to work, right? And then he goes, or else they just won't let you finish, right? And so he said right now at Northwestern, where his daughter, wonderful woman, who's now leaving Swarthmore and is going to be President Smith College, was graduating. Alden Morris was becoming the chair there in sociology, and he had written The Origins of Civil Rights. He says they're open to it. So I go to Northwestern. Out of that comes my works, because you asked us to speak to that. So my first book, Culturicide, Resistance, Survival in Lakota, says you've got 200 years of the Lakota. The focal point is Wounded Knee. Native peoples and Native nations were not supposed to survive that, but they did. And that's why the Sundance was so important. And the picture that I've often talked about before that I showed you a little bit earlier, that picture was taken in the 1930s. As what brought down part of the exhibit at the Peabody, because then you have to say when it reappears, supposedly in the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, ultimately leading to the American Indian Religious and Freedom Act, where did it come from? So they literally said, oh, they learned some of that from us. Oh, they talked to these other people, anything. But the Dakota and the Lakota said, no, we always kept that knowledge alive. So that picture was taken near Cannonball, which is on the north end of the reservation, which is primarily Dakota, Ilihantawan, Dakota people in the 1930s. When I found the picture, I was, oh, I don't know whether I should show this. So I showed it to Mary Louise Defender. She goes, oh, Shinshi, sure, you should. You know, there's my relative. She's talking about, oh, and they always said, why did they invite that photographer? Now we know. Now we know, which is Indian time, of course. And so we showed that, and that meant that what had been taught at places like Harvard was just simply wrong. That it was Indigenous peoples themselves that had kept the knowledge and the tradition and the survivance away. So I have to close this on up. The other two books led to Indigenous peoples and globalization. And then I started working, especially out in California. So this is my great friend, Luke Madrigal. He has family members here in this room here. He was another Kola, and he had helped to bring back the bird songs out in California. He had led just a truly remarkable person, everything we want to see in here. And then the next one we were just out there with Matt Leavis. They restored the Chemehueve Reservation and brought back the salt songs, which everybody said was impossible. And there's an article coming out on the Atlantic where they say, what do you do with 10,000-year-old water? LA wants that water, right? But they have found, they know where the water is through their ancient salt songs and other kind of knowledge. And this is something that's just happened now. So I take 6 points from this. Sorry for taking the extra minutes. The first is acknowledging Indigenous identity and nations and land, which is what you are doing. And 30 years ago, that was a challenge to the system. Challenging the dominant narratives. So this is Konash, this is a Council Native American student. That was just a challenge. And of course, NAGPRA, and then leading to HUNAP. Indigenous leadership must prevail, especially in social movement practices. It must be led by Indigenous people. And that the representation and the perspective, such as like I've shared with you at the Ghost Dance and NAGPRA, must be Indigenous first, probably foremost. Then that we must practice reciprocity and responsibility for the nations and the people, something we find in most Indigenous societies, most Native nations. And then finally, that we work for social and Indigenous justice with truthful narratives in history, with revitalization rising from our resistance and our survivance. And I was going to say I'd be remiss without bringing up my new book, but Joe, you already read it. It's coming on up. But I'd like to end by this famous picture is by calling on the spirits, lifting our sacred and spiritual voices to end genocide. So we would say, Omidakare Oyasi.
Well, thank you, Madeline, for that. And so we have the stage set for what I hope will be some dialogue that's follow. And as I came back to Harvard, never imagining that I would again, and never thinking much about what was going on here, and just like some of you said, the most exciting thing about being back here is having a chance to see and engage with you all and facilitate to maybe a very minor degree your own preparation for leadership and impact and influence in Indian country and beyond in the decades to come. So 30 years from now, you probably have no concept of where you'll be and what you'll be doing and how it will be, and we certainly didn't either. But there's some time and some opportunity to sort out what it will look like for you, and we'll take a little bit of patience. In the meantime, we were talking about change, how to change institutions, how to take those lessons from institutional change into careers and lives even, and people could talk about that. But really, I guess we'd love to open the floor to hear what's on your mind in response to these words. What are the issues that are vexing you the most these days? What do you worry about most for the future? What is it that you are wondering how to undertake or engage in terms of trying to change something for the better? What are your fears? What are your hopes? I mean, anything that comes to mind, these folks are here. So please, the floor is open.
In recent years, I know that ethnic studies have been a big discussion here at Harvard, and I know that that's not the first time they've come up. And I'm sure having an Indigenous studies program is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds and kind of our wishes for the future. What are your thoughts? I know that there are many different experiences across different universities and experience along the way since the 90s. Some of you mentioned it was before some of us were born. So I'd be interested to hear your experiences over the decades, seeing this kind of push for Indigenous focus. I've heard mention of the social sciences making progress. And it's nice to see more faculty on campus kind of embracing these different topics. So I'd be happy to hear some of your reflections.
I'll start off. It's interesting. I remember having a conversation when I was trying to decide what I wanted to pursue my PhD in. And I remember very clearly, this was with an advisor, a non-native advisor. But for me, it was very sound advice in terms of at that point, I had committed myself to kind of pursuing a career in the professoriate. And so in choosing sociology, I was thinking about it strategically in terms of a door that swings in both directions. I was really concerned for myself because I had considered ethnic studies, but at the time I had seen how marginalized it was. And I was a little bit worried in terms of how effective I would be in terms of my work, and very consciously making a decision that I didn't want to do ethnic studies. But you know, I think especially, I can't really speak to ethnic studies, but when I look at the field of Indigenous studies, it's phenomenal what has been happening there. And I think if I were making the choice today, I might consider Indigenous studies, because when I look at the scholarship that's been produced, probably over, I think about in particular over the past decade, I see work being produced by people that oftentimes come from mainstream or traditional disciplines, but are really giving voice and claiming space, bringing in methodologies. I think that in ways that has not just legitimized it, but has really kind of provided kind of alternative ways of doing research. I certainly have felt for myself that it's enabled me to kind of do the type of research that I do. I do a lot of community engaged research throughout the whole process. I mean, it's a challenge, you know, when you're working alongside community. I mean, the IRB process can be very protracted. The grant writing could be very protracted, but I feel like it's producing work that is not just benefiting my career, another article on my CV, but it's really community driven. I'm a huge advocate of tribally driven research and research that supports tribal sovereignty. And I see the work that's being produced within the field of Indigenous studies as not only making that possible in terms of providing frameworks, but helping to elevate, if you will, and illuminate what Indigenous scholars bring, not just in the field of Indigenous studies, but within the disciplines themselves. And I think about, you know, Gabby, the challenges you face in your research, and our colleague Bernie Curley, who was in anthropology at the time. I mean, this was a challenge for faculty. And I want to believe that it should be less of a challenge now, because you can turn to books, you can turn to publications that show it as a legitimate, whether it's a methodology or a theory or what have you. I want to think that, you know, it is now possible. And so I sometimes find myself a little bit surprised that I am an advocate of Indigenous studies. I might have chosen that career, but I think that regardless of whatever field you're in, I think you still have the opportunity to try and create that type of intellectual change in the work that you do. I would hope that for many of you, it speaks across disciplines. And I guess that's the other thing. I never thought about myself as a transdisciplinary scholar. It was always what I was doing, but it's interesting when all of a sudden there's this label that's kind of out there. It's like, oh, I'm a transdisciplinary scholar. Just like community engaged research. I think for many of us, we were doing that the whole time. I mean, there's a certain kind of ethic to it. Of course, you're going to be in conversation with community. I think the thing that I find most gratifying right now is all of the discussion around positionality. Because what I do remember here, talking to potential advisors and really being, you know, dissuaded from doing the work that I wanted to do because of bias. And I didn't really have a language to talk about, you know, the importance of positionality and how that lived experience and that cumulative knowledge really informs and advances the work. This isn't something to be overcome. So yeah, it's exciting to see the work that's going on now. And I don't know, maybe I would have done a degree in Indigenous studies if it were available at the time.
Just a quick aside, tonight you're getting a note from Professor Begay, a sociologist.
That's true.
You mentioned Bernie Curley and Professor Curley and three other Native American conferences will be coming next month.
Oh,
So yeah, mentioned that we got.
so nice.
And other folks on Indigenous studies, thoughts?
I mean, so I had this experience of, I ended up going into, as soon as I finished my doctorate in sociology, within 4 days was at National Museum of American Indian before it was built. Not a classic move for, where you would go as a sociologist and thought I'd be there for a year, stayed for like 20. And this is also where there were these questions about if you're taking Indigenous approaches, working with Indigenous knowledge, this idea that, it's like, how can we do this work without community engagement? How is it possible? And this is something I think in effect that Ines had brought in as well, about how is it that we can only look, through one lens, even if we're going into something with a particular discipline, when you're working with Indigenous knowledge and systems, how can you not at least be mindful or informed by others? And so rather than it being solid, what I've seen develop, at least in the, across disciplines, but also in the museum world, with the impact of the development of Indigenous studies approaches. Right now, I took on a project at Smithsonian American Art Museum, which wants indigenized sections of their curatorial work, their art history. And that would not have happened without the surge of, I don't think, Indigenous studies. So rather than disrupt or silo or take over, it has like reinfused back into shifting other fields that would normally sat outside of Indigenous studies work. It's been this just kind of occurred to me in the past week where I had a meeting with them and seeing that rather than curtail or put Indigenous study into a particular box, it actually has come back around into other disciplines and also normalize. I think that we're moving into the normalizing of best practice from Indigenous studies lens, whether it's uniquely into itself or exists alongside of it. This is right.
Keep in mind that Native American and Indigenous Studies Association has an annual meeting. It hasn't met for years, but it is meeting in May. And maybe some of you would want to apply for HUNAP funds to go. So think about that. Toronto, that's what college. What else is on your mind?
I know my kola is a professor of Indigenous studies. And he said some very brilliant things when he came in with us where Joe was like our lead-off person, and did a brilliant job too. So maybe as a professor of Indigenous studies, you can share some of your wisdom with us.
Yeah, thank you, Kula. The question that was asked points at knowledge, and in particular, Indigenous knowledge. And, the Indigenous studies has been around, since the 60s. And and Angela is absolutely correct, it has evolved into a discipline that is just going at leaps and bounds. And I think the fundamental question beneath the question that was asked is, what kind of knowledge do you want to gain in a university setting? What do you want to know when you leave the university? Will it prepare you to live where you want to live? Will it prepare you to be the person that you want to be? So those are all really important questions about how you evolve, how you want to evolve, and also what kind of knowledge and understanding do you want to have for your children, for your grandchildren? How do you want them to live? Because the time that you're spending in a university setting, you're just setting the stage for your children, for your grandchildren, for your great-grandchildren. What do you want to teach them when they're adults? So, you know, time is really short. I mean, just a short time ago, I was at Harvard, and here I am nearing retirement. It just flies by just like that. So you have to spend your time wisely. Spend it in such a way that you want to gain the knowledge that you want to gain. For me, it's really about Indigenous knowledge, and has really focused more on traditional Indigenous knowledge. There are all these issues, modern day issues that we're facing. Prominent among all of them is climate change. So now, who do you want to study from about climate change? What about other social issues or environmental issues that are political issues that are pressing? Where there's a war going on between Ukraine and Russia, but for all intents and purposes, the United States is involved. So how do you handle that? How would a traditional Indigenous person handle that? And what are the knowledges you need to know to resolve these issues? So when you're thinking about Indigenous studies, you're actually talking about Indigenous knowledge on a variety of levels. So if there's any regret that I have, it's really that I should have spent more time with my grandpa and my grandma, because I really want to know more about what they knew so that I can resolve issues that are pressing today in modern society. So, you know, what's the worth of Indigenous studies? As Angela was referring to, it's huge. It is huge. That's who we are. That's what we're about. And if you want to create a life, you have to have Indigenous knowledge to be able to understand the world. Thanks.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for coming and speaking with us. It's truly an honor to be here in the same room as all of you. I'm curious to know if you had any troubles or how you were able to, or I guess allow Central and South American Indigenous students know that what you were working on was available to them as well.
And I'm so glad that you brought that forward, because certainly at the time there had been maybe about 15, 20 years, especially in the 90s, of connections being made across artificial borders. The communities that were here in the Boston, Cambridge area, really like more at the community level. So what I'm thinking is really where we were, where we were interacting, bringing people in on programs, looking at genocidal matters, particularly in Central America, the uprisings, and South America. We had a program, I remember it was on I was on the Holocaust in my car. So I think it's a learned that Norwegian was so important. To engage in those conversations and, you know, at the time actually on campus, now that I, you know, when I'm thinking about it, Konash was very northern in its student composition at that time. So it was almost like, my experience of it was that it was more northern US, Canada, with some engagement, but not as much in terms of students, but community interrelationships and who we were, you know, talking to was much more hemispheric. And so I think that that's probably a development that has happened much more extensively, because at the time I don't even know if we had you know, how much there was involvement of Pacific Island, you know, Indigenous people of the Pacific with us at that moment, maybe to a smaller degree, but that was something that definitely expanded afterwards. So that was like that, it was like that moment of pivot. But you know, like Manley was talking about the involvement with MECHA and other organizations, and I think that also has to do with where people were starting to reconnect in their identities as well, especially out here on the East Coast. It's a good question. I don't know if others have other insights.
To remember, and I don't know, maybe you all have different, maybe you can jog my memory on this, but in a lot of the spaces that I have been, both as a student and now as faculty, there's a lot of identity politics around who is Native, who isn't Native, who gets included and who doesn't get included. And I don't really recall that being as big of an issue at the time, here at least. And I don't know if it's because I think we were all just trying to survive, you know, and so, you know, when you're looking for a lifeline, you know, it's like you don't kind of turn away offers for help. But I guess I'm kind of curious to, and I don't know if that was in some ways kind of, you know, the impetus for the question, but I would be curious to know if I could ask a question of the group, you know, around those identity politics issues, because I know at ASU it rears itself in a lot of different ways in a lot of different contexts, and I never know how much of it is a compositional effect of the place we happen to be in. Arizona, 22 tribal nations. There's a very strong tribal presence that centers around federal recognition, and so much of the conversation is around, you know, recognized versus unrecognized. But I would be really curious to know what that experience is like, if it's even an issue here. I see a couple of people kind of shaking their heads like it is an issue.
Like, I guess. I mean, I've had to deal with it in my own ways, and I guess my question to you guys is, how do you deal with it? Like, or is there a way to deal with it that doesn't come at the emotional cost of yourself? And like having to always explain and give these really hard insights every time to almost justify. Because it's hard and it's tolling and it's just a lot.
Yeah, I try and be very self-aware of the fact that, you know, so my husband is a member of a state recognized tribe. I'm a member of a federally recognized tribe. And so we've kind of experienced these, you know, in shared spaces. And so having had the opportunity to spend time in his community, it's really made me appreciate, you know, how Native or Indigenous they are, and really kind of recognizing, you know, really the arbitrariness of, you know, kind of the in some ways kind of like the historical arbitrariness, because he's from North Carolina, and so they have a completely different history. It's hard, I know, because I've seen these conversations, I've seen it among my colleagues at campus, and it's one of those things I always feel like, goodness, why are we doing this to ourselves? There's so few of us anyways. Why do we engage in these types of identity politics? And I always hope that there's enough people that are willing to kind of not engage in it. But it happens in a lot of interesting ways. And I think I so recall from my time here, when we would often do introductions, in a group, I would often hear some of our fellow students almost apologizing. Well, I didn't grow up on my reservation, I don't speak my language. And that type of stuff is just really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
We, in some ways, don't have control of our histories. And, for people to have to apologize, yeah, I don't know. That still troubles me. Yeah. I don't know, is that some of the experience that you all kind of have? I mean, yeah, sort of.
It'd be interesting to hear from Manley again, especially because I know he was doing things with Harvard and some of the other foundations. I can share 3 quick experiences that I've had. So I was part of the Indigenous Perspective program, and we were with the Adibasi and Indian, Maori. We ended up in Mexico, and then we go down first to Oaxaca. And of course, many Zapotecas and the Mixteca up in LA. Then we go to Chiapas, and we go to the Zapatistas, right? And their identity is so strong because it was as an armed uprising, and they collectivized, but everybody identifies as the community they're from, and that's it's both a resistance and empowering identity. And then another one is when Manley gave me a call, kind of wondering who I was, and she was checking up on me. We didn't know each other then. I was down in Nicaragua, and the only reason I got to go there is because I happen to know a couple of Mosquito people, and the other people were connected with all this was when the Sandinistas were having that second set of elections. And the question is, who are the Mosquito? So there's just an incredible dialogue. The United States said, oh, they're Contra and all that. So we got down there, we got out to the Mosquito, out in Puerto Cabezas, we went out to their communities. Wow, what a powerful experience. And then you can find this book, Rafaga, the story of the Mosquito fighter. So their legendary leader, Soton, then told us, well, we would have fought the Americans if they had come in here, but the Sandinistas, because, and then again, name that indigenous identity. And it's only the suppression of that they rose on up. And the last group I'm thinking about is as far south, or pretty far south. So it's with the Mapuches and the Palenche in Chile. And they got a pretty interesting political fight going on right now. A lot of them are getting thrown into jail and prison. And an interesting thing when we were down there with them was that they were having the same issue with the people that would either go to Santiago or Concepcion or some of the cities. They go, so we're arguing how strong they are. And then finally they decided, well, as long as they remember where they're from, then they're still part of our peoples. I know Manley has some good stories there too.
Thanks. There's a prophecy that has been spelled out about the eagle and the condor meeting. So the condor from down south and the eagle here up north. So this prophecy, in many ways, is really coming to fruition. And Angela is absolutely correct about identity politics. The way I see that is it's really a waste of time and it's fruitless to say, well, I'm full blood and you're half blood. Or I speak the language, you don't speak the language. I'm from on res and you're off res. All of that is fruitless. It's a fruitless debate that goes on. And And I think what's so critical and important is for you to gain strength, build your identity, develop it to a point where you feel comfortable, where you feel as though that you're growing. I traveled all through Mexico, traveled around in Brazil, and went to New Zealand many times to Aotearoa with the Maoris. And I saw something that really made me change and think very differently about identity politics. There was a group of elders, Maori elders on one side, there was a group of Maori youth on the other side. And they were having a discussion, and the youth would ask the elders questions, and then the elders would answer the questions. And one of the questions that the youth asked the elders was this: who's real Maori? That was the question. So who's really real? And the elders got together and talked about the question and then came back with an answer. And here was their answer. I was watching this unfold in front of me. And the answer was no one, they said. No one is real Maori. So the youth asked why. And here was the answer from the elders. They said, it takes a lifetime to become real. So it takes a whole lifetime to gather all this knowledge and understanding about who you are, what you're all about. And it's only then that you can kind of consider yourself real, when you're 102 years old, seeing your grandkids or your great-grandkids running around. And only then can you begin to understand what real really means. And it was a huge education for me to see the dynamics of identity politics sort of just exploding there. But for you as young adults, it's so important for you to spend time in building your identity. If you don't know the language, learn it. If you don't know the stories, learn it. If you don't know songs, learn it. If you don't know prayers, learn it. You have a lifetime to do this. And your goal really is to live to old age. That's your purpose in life. So within that span of time, what is it that you want to learn? What is it that you want to be? And then make a plan to do that, to accomplish that, to become, as the Maori elders said, real. And you have a lifetime to do that. So I challenge you to do that. And don't waste your time on identity politics.
Thank you, Manley. And we have some refreshment waiting for us, so I think we should probably adjourn to do that. But before we do that, Professor Begay, Professor Gonzalez, Professor Fenelon, thank you very much for spending your time and contributing. Let's offer our gratitude, please. And visited formally at the reception, which is on the 10th floor, I think, in the same room where we said farewell to Jason. Food and refreshment, please. And Manley, we're so sorry you're not able to join us for that. We wish you very well. Have a good night. Thank you.
Nice seeing you, Manley.
Nice to see you, Manley.
Bye, everyone. Hey, Jim, I want you to have a hamburger over at Charlie's for you. or pizza uno.